The once brilliant skyline of Chicago loomed in the distance, a stark reminder of everything John Hartley had lost. Just months ago, he had been one of its proud architects, figuratively and literally, celebrated as a real estate mogul with a sharp mind and a seemingly unshakable empire. Now, all that remained was the hollow ache of failure and the bitter chill of winter. John sat on the edge of a tattered bed in his rusty trailer, the weak hum of a space heater barely keeping the cold at bay. The trailer was parked in a desolate lot, surrounded by bare trees that swayed under the weight of frost. A thin layer of snow blanketed the ground, muffling the world around him into a deafening silence. Inside, the cramped space reeked of stale coffee and unwashed clothes, a far cry from the sleek penthouse he used to call home. The fall had been swift and merciless. A string of bad investments had drained his accounts, but it was the betrayal of his trusted business partner, Marcus Dalton, that had delivered the fatal blow. Marcus had siphoned funds from their biggest project, leaving John to shoulder the blame and face financial ruin. The press had been relentless, portraying him as reckless and incompetent. His clients vanished, his friends turned their backs, and his once solid reputation crumbled like the properties he had once developed. For weeks, John had wallowed in his despair, surviving on instant noodles and cheap whiskey, avoiding the mirror that reflected a man he no longer recognized. His broad shoulders slumped, his hair unkempt, and his sharp blue eyes dulled with exhaustion. The vibrant, ambitious man who had once commanded boardrooms with ease seemed like a distant memory. As he stared at the frost-covered window, a flicker of resolve stirred within him. Sitting here waiting for salvation wasn't an option. Not anymore. His pride, though battered, wouldn't allow it. He reached for his threadbare coat and scarf, wrapping them tightly around him. "I'll find something," he muttered to himself, his voice low but steady. With each step out of the trailer, the bitter wind bit at his face. But John pressed on, unsure of where he was going or what awaited him. He only knew one thing. Staying here meant giving up entirely, and he wasn't ready to surrender just yet. The aroma of steaming soup and freshly baked bread filled the air, cutting through the icy chill of Chicago's streets. In a small park downtown, volunteers bustled around makeshift tables, distributing meals to a growing line of people in need. Among them was Emily Parker, her breath forming small clouds as she smiled warmly at each person who approached. Emily had grown used to the long hours of her job at the diner, but she always made time for these community events. Her vibrant energy stood out, even in the bleakness of winter. A knit beanie covered her auburn hair, and her gloved hands moved deftly as she ladled soup into bowls. Despite the biting wind, she radiated a quiet determination that seemed to brighten the gray surroundings. Further back in the line, John Hartley shuffled forward, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. His hollowed eyes scanned the scene, taking in the small comforts of warmth and human kindness that felt so foreign to him now. He didn't want to be here, didn't want to accept charity, but hunger had gnawed at his resolve. The smells and the promise of a warm meal had finally pulled him out of his pride. When it was his turn, Emily's gentle voice greeted him. "Hi there. What can I get you? Soup and bread okay?" John hesitated, his gaze briefly meeting hers. Her eyes were soft but steady, a mixture of compassion and resilience he hadn't encountered in years. For a moment, he felt exposed, as though she could see through the walls he had built around himself. "Yeah," he muttered, barely audible. Emily's smile didn't waver. She handed him a bowl and added, "Take your time. There's coffee on the table over there if you want to warm up." "Thanks," he replied, clutching the bowl as though it were a lifeline. As he walked toward the table, something about her tugged at his memory. Her voice, her presence. It felt familiar, like a fragment of a long-forgotten dream. He shook the thought away. It couldn't be. Emily watched him leave, her brow furrowing slightly. There was something in his eyes that stirred her empathy, a silent pain that felt all too familiar. But for now, she simply moved to the next person in line, her kindness unwavering. The clinking of coffee cups and the low hum of conversation filled the small diner where Emily Parker spent most of her waking hours. Nestled on a quiet corner of a bustling Chicago neighborhood, the diner had become a haven for locals, a place where time seemed to slow down amidst the city's relentless pace. Emily loved it here, not because the work was glamorous, but because it felt like home, something she'd spent much of her life searching for. Orphaned at the age of 7, Emily had been shuffled between foster homes, each one a little less welcoming than the last. Stability was a luxury she never knew, and her childhood was a patchwork of temporary places and fleeting relationships. But through it all, she'd learned to rely on her resilience, building a life brick by brick, even if the foundation had been shaky. The diner was her cornerstone. After years of hard work, she had earned the trust of its elderly owner, Mrs. Jenkins, who treated Emily like the daughter she never had. Now, with Mrs. Jenkins retired and living out of state, Emily managed the place as though it were her own. She poured her heart into creating a space where anyone could feel at ease. A warm meal, a kind smile, and a refuge from life's storms. But not everyone saw the diner as a beacon of hope. Marcus Dalton, a slick developer with a reputation for ruthlessness, had been circling like a vulture for months. He wanted the land for his latest project, a high-end condominium that promised to revitalize the area. Emily knew better. His so-called revitalization meant pushing out the small businesses and families who had built the neighborhood. She sighed, leaning against the counter as the late afternoon lull settled over the diner. A folder filled with paperwork from Dalton's lawyers sat unopened in the back office. The latest offer was more than generous by most standards, but Emily wasn't interested in the money. Selling the diner would mean erasing a piece of herself, a piece she wasn't ready to let go of. "Emily, you okay?" asked Beth, a high school student who worked part-time as a waitress. Emily forced a smile. "Just thinking. Everything's fine." But it wasn't. The threat to the diner loomed like a storm on the horizon, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. As the bell above the door jingled, she turned her attention back to the present, vowing to fight for the place that had given her so much. The low hum of traffic outside the diner filtered through the frosted glass windows as John Hartley sipped a cup of coffee, his eyes darting to Emily whenever she moved across the room. She had a way of bringing light to the simplest things, from the way she smiled at customers to the warm laugh that occasionally rose above the clatter of dishes. Watching her now, it was impossible to ignore the faint familiarity tugging at the edges of his mind. John leaned back in his chair, staring into the dark liquid swirling in his mug. Memories long buried began to surface. He saw a little girl with auburn hair and a fearless grin, her small hands gripping his as they raced through a sunlit field back in Dallas. Emily. She had been his closest friend, his unwavering ally in a world that often felt too big and too lonely. Back then, he'd promised to protect her, no matter what. But that was a lifetime ago. Before life took them down separate paths, before betrayal and failure turned him into the shell of a man sitting here today. He glanced at his reflection in the coffee. How could he reveal himself to her now? What would she think of the man he'd become? His thoughts darkened as they drifted to Marcus Dalton. The name alone sent a wave of bitterness through him. Marcus had been more than a business partner. He'd been a friend, someone John trusted like family. That trust had been shattered when Marcus siphoned millions from their project, leaving John to shoulder the collapse alone. The betrayal still stung, not just for the financial ruin it caused, but for how easily Marcus had discarded him. The bell above the diner door jingled, snapping John back to the present. His body stiffened as Marcus walked in, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Dressed in an expensive suit, Marcus exuded confidence, the kind that came from stepping on others to climb higher. "Emily," Marcus called, his voice dripping with practiced charm. "We need to talk." John stayed in his seat, gripping his coffee cup tightly as he watched Emily's expression harden. She stepped forward, calm but firm. "If it's about the diner, my answer hasn't changed." Marcus smirked, leaning closer. "Think carefully. Everyone has a price, Emily. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." John's jaw tightened as he observed the exchange. He couldn't sit back and let Marcus threaten her. Not again. But revealing himself now would change everything. For now, he remained in the shadows, watching and waiting. The late afternoon lull at the diner brought a calm that Emily always appreciated. It gave her time to breathe, tidy up, and chat with the few regulars who lingered over their coffee. She noticed John sitting in the corner, hunched over his mug like it was the only thing keeping him warm. He'd been there for hours, silent and solitary, a stark contrast to the lively energy of the place. "More coffee?" she asked, approaching his table with the pot in hand. John looked up, startled for a moment, before nodding. Sure.
Thanks.
Emily filled his cup and smiled. You've been nursing that one for a while. I figured it was time for a refill. John managed a small smile, the first she'd seen from him. It's good coffee. Flattery will get you everywhere, she said with a light laugh, pulling out the chair across from him. Mind if I sit for a minute? John hesitated, but then nodded. Go ahead. So, what brings you to our little diner? Emily asked, her tone casual but curious. John stared into his coffee, choosing his words carefully. Needed a warm place to sit for a while. This seemed inviting. Well, I'm glad you found us. This place has been a refuge for a lot of folks, Emily said, her voice softening. I guess you could say it's got a bit of a magic touch. John raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching. Magic, huh? Okay, maybe not magic. More like good coffee and decent company, Emily said with a grin. But sometimes that's enough. They fell into an easy rhythm, the conversation flowing naturally. Emily shared snippets of her life, how she loved the diner, the community it served, and the way it felt like a second home. John listened more than he spoke, offering small, guarded glimpses into his life. He mentioned his love for architecture, avoiding the specifics of his downfall. Emily didn't press, sensing he wasn't ready to share more. You know, Emily said after a pause, we're always looking for an extra hand around here. If you're interested, I could use some help with the odd jobs. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work. John blinked, surprised by the offer. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't want to be a burden. You wouldn't be, Emily said firmly. Think about it, okay? No pressure. As she got up to serve another customer, John watched her go, a strange warmth blooming in his chest. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to hope for. Possibility. The diner felt different from the cold streets John had wandered for months. It was alive with energy, its walls filled with the chatter of regulars, the occasional clink of plates, and the warm smell of coffee and pancakes. As John wiped down tables and refilled condiments, he couldn't help but feel a strange mix of gratitude and discomfort. It had been years since he'd done work like this, work that left his hands raw and his back aching. Emily caught his eye from behind the counter, giving him a thumbs up. You're doing great, she said with a wink, her voice cutting through his self-doubt. Thanks, John mumbled, managing a faint smile. Her encouragement made the work a little lighter. Grateful as he was for the chance, shame lingered at the edges of his thoughts. He couldn't shake the memory of his old life, the penthouses, the tailored suits, the power he once wielded. Now, he was cleaning tables and washing dishes. But as the hours passed, something surprising happened. The routine, the rhythm of the diner, and the occasional thank you from a customer began to chip away at his despair. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. Later that evening, as the dinner rush dwindled, Emily joined him at a corner booth, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. She seemed more tired than usual, her smile dimmed by a weight she didn't try to hide. You okay? John asked, his voice cautious but genuine. Emily sighed, staring into her mug. It's Marcus Dalton. He's relentless. He keeps upping his offers, but it's not about the money. The diner isn't just a business to me. It's a part of this community. People come here because it feels like home. If I sell, I lose that. They lose that. John leaned forward, his grip tightening around his cup. Marcus's name was like a jagged edge in his mind. The betrayal still burned, and now seeing how his greed threatened Emily only fueled his resolve. You can't let him win, John said firmly. This place matters. To you, to the people who come here. He doesn't care about any of that. Emily gave him a small smile, her tired eyes softening. It means a lot to hear that. John nodded, his decision solidifying in his mind. He didn't know how yet, but he would stop Marcus. For Emily, for the diner, and maybe, just maybe, to reclaim a piece of himself he thought was gone forever. The steady hum of the diner wrapped the space in warmth as John moved through his shift, settling into the rhythm of his work. Over the past weeks, he had grown accustomed to the routine, stacking plates, pouring coffee, and stealing moments to watch Emily in her element. She carried herself with an effortless grace, her laughter filling the air like a melody that made even the most jaded regulars crack a smile. It was in these small moments that their bond began to grow. Emily's lighthearted teasing had a way of breaking through John's guarded exterior, and he found himself looking forward to her company. Their conversations ranged from the mundane, debating the best pie flavor on the menu, to fleeting glimpses of deeper truths. She had a way of drawing him out, though he still kept parts of himself hidden. One particularly busy afternoon, as the diner bustled with chatter and the clang of silverware, the mood shifted when a customer's raised voice cut through the noise. "This coffee's cold, and I've been waiting for my order forever," the man barked, glaring at Emily as she approached his table. "I'm sorry about the delay," Emily said, her voice calm but firm. "I'll get you a fresh cup right away." "That's not good enough," he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. "Do you even know how to run this place?" Before Emily could respond, John stepped in, his tall frame casting a shadow over the man. "That's enough," he said, his voice low and steady but leaving no room for argument. "She's doing her job. You've had your coffee and your food's coming. Show some respect." The man hesitated under John's sharp gaze, muttering something unintelligible before turning his attention back to his cup. Emily looked up at John, her gratitude evident in her soft smile. "Thanks," she said once they were out of earshot. "Anytime," John replied, his voice quieter now. He hadn't meant to step in so forcefully, but seeing someone disrespect Emily had struck a nerve. Later that night, as the neon open sign buzzed softly in the window, the diner was quiet, save for the occasional clatter from the kitchen. Emily and John sat at the counter, nursing cups of coffee. The dim light cast a warm glow, softening the sharp edges of the world outside. "You didn't have to do that earlier," Emily said, breaking the silence. "But I'm glad you did." John shrugged, staring into his mug. "It wasn't right, the way he talked to you." "You're good at that, you know," she said, her voice lighter now. "Protecting people." He looked at her then, his expression a mix of surprise and something softer. "I don't know about that." Emily studied him, her head tilting slightly. "There's more to you than you let on, John Hartley." He stiffened slightly, but her tone wasn't accusatory, just curious. Vulnerability flickered across his face before he managed a small smile. "Maybe someday I'll tell you the whole story." She nodded, accepting his words for now. "Whenever you're ready." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the neon lights painting faint streaks of red and blue on the counter. For the first time in years, John felt something he hadn't dared to hope for, the stirrings of trust and perhaps something more. The morning started like any other, with the smell of frying bacon and fresh coffee filling the diner. Emily moved through the space with practiced ease, smiling at customers and chatting with regulars. But beneath her cheerful demeanor, worry simmered. Over the past few days, deliveries had been delayed or outright canceled, leaving the pantry dangerously low on key supplies. She suspected Marcus Dalton was behind it, though he'd left no obvious trail. John noticed the tension in her movements, the way her hands lingered on the counter, her eyes darting toward the kitchen. He'd been quietly observing her for weeks now, learning to read the subtle signs of her mood. Today, her usual brightness was dulled, and it unsettled him. "Emily," he said during a brief lull, "everything okay?" She hesitated, then sighed. "Suppliers are pulling out. First, the dairy guy said he's overbooked. Then the bakery called this morning saying they couldn't meet our orders." "It's too much of a coincidence." John's jaw tightened. He knew Marcus well enough to recognize his tactics. The man didn't just bulldoze his way to victory. He squeezed his opponents until they had no choice but to fold. John had seen it before, and he wasn't going to let it happen to Emily. After the lunch rush, John stepped outside, pretending to take out the trash. In truth, he was making a call. Over the years, he'd cultivated contacts in the business world, some of whom still owed him favors. One of them was a logistics manager who could discreetly confirm if Marcus had leaned on the suppliers. The call confirmed his suspicions. Marcus had applied pressure, leveraging his influence to disrupt the diner's operations. It was a dirty game, but it also meant Marcus had left a trail, one John could use. Meanwhile, back inside, Emily found herself in the small office at the rear of the diner, rummaging through a stack of old papers. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe reassurance, maybe a solution. Instead, she stumbled upon a letter from her late foster mother, a woman who had shaped much of who she was today. The letter was simple but powerful, Fight for what matters, Emily. When you hold on to the things that make life worth living, you'll always find a way forward. The words felt like a lifeline, grounding her resolve. That evening, as the last customer left and the bell above the door jingled softly, Marcus walked in. His polished shoes clicked against the tiles, his confidence radiating like a weapon. Emily straightened her shoulders, refusing to let him see her unease. "This has gone on long enough," Marcus said, his smile sharp. "You're running out of options, Emily. Sell now, while the offer's still good." Emily held her ground. "The answer hasn't changed, Marcus. The diner isn't for sale." Marcus's expression darkened, his voice lowering. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. You don't want to see what happens when I stop playing nice." As he turned to leave, John stepped out from the kitchen, his presence unmistakable. He didn't speak, but his steady gaze followed Marcus until the door swung shut behind him. Emily exhaled shakily, looking at John. "He's not going to stop, is he?" "No," John said, his voice firm. "But neither are we." For the first time, they stood united against the storm, ready to fight back. John paced the narrow alley behind the diner, his breath forming clouds in the crisp evening air. He'd been wrestling with himself all day, the weight of his past and the urgency of the present colliding in his mind. He needed help to take on Marcus, but asking for it meant confronting the ghosts he'd been running from. Finally, he pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen before dialing an old contact. The line rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "John Hartley," the man said, his tone cautious. "Didn't expect to hear from you. Sam, I wouldn't be calling if it wasn't important," John replied, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "I need information on Marcus Dalton. He's targeting a diner that means a lot to someone I care about." There was a pause on the other end before Sam sighed. "I'll see what I can do. But John, you know Marcus doesn't play fair. Be careful." As the call ended, John felt a flicker of hope. Sam was a former investigator with access to resources John couldn't reach on his own. It was a small step, but it was something. Later that evening, John and Emily sat in the quiet diner, the day's chaos fading into the background. Emily poured herself a cup of tea and offered one to John, who accepted with a nod. For a moment, they sat in silence, the soft glow of the overhead lights casting warm shadows around them. "You've been distracted today," Emily said gently, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" John hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "It's just, I've been thinking about how much this place means to you, how much you're fighting for it." Emily leaned forward, her gaze steady. "It's not just about the diner. It's about the people who come here, the connections we've built. It's like, a piece of my soul is in these walls." Her words stirred something in John. "When I was a kid," he began, his voice quieter now, "I knew someone who used to fight for things like that. She believed in standing up for what mattered, no matter how hard it got." Emily tilted her head, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "She sounds like someone special." "She was," John said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "She made me believe in things I didn't think were possible. I lost sight of that somewhere along the way." Emily reached out, placing a hand on his. "Maybe it's time you start believing again." Her touch, warm and steady, sent a wave of calm through him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone in the fight. The next morning, armed with renewed determination, John followed a lead Sam had sent him. It led him to an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city, one that Marcus had used as a storage facility during their partnership. The building was abandoned now, its windows cracked and its walls marked with graffiti. Inside, John combed through dusty boxes and rusted filing cabinets, his heart pounding as he searched for anything he could use. Hours passed before he found it, a folder buried beneath stacks of forgotten paperwork. Inside were records detailing illegal transactions Marcus had orchestrated, using shell companies to cover his tracks. Holding the folder, John felt a surge of vindication. This was it, a way to expose Marcus and stop him from destroying everything Emily had worked for. As he stepped out into the cold, the weight of the folder in his hands, John looked toward the horizon. Redemption wasn't just a distant dream anymore. It was within reach. For Emily, for the diner, and for the man he wanted to become, he was ready to fight. The diner was quiet as Emily tidied up for the night. The warm glow of the lights softened the shadows outside, and the faint hum of the neon sign above the door buzzed steadily. She grabbed John's jacket from the back of a chair where he'd left it earlier. It was old and worn, but it was all he had. As she folded it neatly, something slipped from one of the pockets and fluttered to the floor. Curious, Emily bent down and picked it up. It was a photograph, faded and creased at the edges. Her breath caught as she studied the image. 2 children, grinning ear to ear, sitting on a tree swing. One of them was unmistakably her, no older than 7. The boy beside her was just as familiar. Her heart raced as realization dawned. It was John. The door to the kitchen swung open, and John walked in, wiping his hands on a towel. He froze when he saw Emily holding the photo. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice low. Emily held it up, her expression a mix of surprise and hurt. "In your jacket, John. Why didn't you tell me?" He sighed, his shoulders slumping as he leaned against the counter. "I didn't know how. Seeing you again after all these years. I was afraid you'd think I wasn't the same person you knew back then." Emily stepped closer, her grip tightening on the photograph. "You're not the same person, John. Neither am I. But that doesn't mean I wouldn't have cared. I didn't want to let you down," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "You've built this incredible life, Emily. And me? I'm just trying to pick up the pieces of mine." Her anger softened as she saw the vulnerability in his eyes. She placed the photo on the counter and reached for his hand. "You didn't have to hide this from me. I would have understood. We were kids back then, but what we had, it mattered. It still does." John met her gaze, his throat tightening. "I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner." Emily nodded, her hand still holding his. "It hurt to find out this way, but I get it. You've been through so much. But, John, you don't have to do this alone anymore." They stood in silence for a moment, the air between them heavy but full of unspoken understanding. Finally, John spoke, his voice steadier now. "Marcus isn't going to stop until he gets what he wants. I can't let that happen. Not to you, not to the diner." Emily squeezed his hand. "Then we fight him together. No more secrets." A flicker of hope sparked in John's chest as her words settled over him. "Together," he echoed. As they locked the diner for the night, stepping out into the crisp air, the weight of the past began to lift. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, they faced it side by side, bound by a shared resolve and a bond stronger than either of them had realized. The early morning light filtered through the diner's windows, casting long shadows across the floor. John and Emily sat huddled in the corner booth. The worn folder John had uncovered spread open on the table between them. Its contents were damning: financial records, signed agreements, and blueprints, all detailing Marcus Dalton's plans to raise several blocks of the neighborhood, including the diner, to make way for luxury condominiums. But the most disturbing part wasn't just the destruction of the diner. It was the human cost. The plans clearly showed that dozens of families living in affordable housing units nearby would be evicted, left with nowhere to go. Emily's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents, each page a fresh blow. "They'll lose everything," she whispered, her voice heavy with disbelief. "Homes, businesses, their sense of stability, all for some overpriced condos no one here can afford." John's jaw tightened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "This is Marcus's MO. He doesn't see people, Emily. Just numbers and profits." Emily straightened, her initial shock hardening into resolve. "We can't let him do this." John watched her, marveling at the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just fighting for the diner. She was fighting for everyone who called this neighborhood home. And yet, doubt gnawed at him. Would she still see him the same way, knowing he'd once been part of Marcus's world? That he'd stood by, blind to the damage his partnership had caused? "I'll get the word out," Emily said, pulling him from his thoughts. "The people here deserve to know what's happening. They'll stand with us." By that evening, the diner buzzed with energy. Tables were pushed together to make space for the gathering, and Emily stood at the front, speaking with a passion that lit up the room. "Marcus Dalton thinks he can take what doesn't belong to him," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But we're more than numbers on a page. We're a community, and if we stand together, we can stop him." The crowd erupted in cheers, but John stood near the back, his heart heavy. He should have felt hopeful, inspired even. Instead, guilt weighed him down. He couldn't shake the fear that if Emily knew the full extent of his ties to Marcus, she might see him as part of the problem. As the meeting dispersed, John lingered outside the diner, the crisp night air doing little to soothe his turmoil. He stared at the pavement, lost in thought, when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and Marcus stepped out, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. "Well, well," Marcus said, his tone dripping with mockery. "I had a feeling you were behind this." John turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "You mean standing up to you?" "Someone had to," Marcus smirked, taking a step closer. "You've always been good at biting off more than you can chew, John. But this? Rallying a bunch of locals against me? It's pathetic." John stood his ground, his fists clenched. "They have every right to fight for their homes. You can't steamroll over people and expect no one to push back." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You think you found some redemption by playing the hero? Let me remind you, John, you're just as responsible for what's happening as I am. You were there when we started laying the groundwork for projects like this. Don't forget who you are." The words hit harder than John wanted to admit, but he refused to let Marcus see it. "I'm not that person anymore." Marcus chuckled darkly. "We'll see. But I'll tell you this. If you keep meddling, it won't just be the diner you lose. Think about that." He climbed back into his car, the threat hanging in the air as the vehicle disappeared into the night. John stood there for a long time, Marcus's words echoing in his mind. When he finally turned back toward the diner, Emily was standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and her gaze steady. "Marcus?" she asked, her tone careful. "Yeah," John replied, his voice low. "He knows." Emily stepped closer, her expression softening. "Then it's a good thing we're not backing down." Her words steadied him, even as his fears lingered. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The diner brimmed with life, every table occupied by neighbors who had rallied around Emily's call to action. Conversations overlapped, filled with hope, determination, and defiance. John stood near the counter, watching the scene unfold with a mix of pride and gratitude. Emily had done this. Her conviction had brought them all together, turning the diner into the heart of a resistance movement. At one table, a retired teacher scribbled notes on strategies to raise awareness. Nearby, a young couple brainstormed ideas for social media campaigns. Even the gruff mechanic who rarely spoke offered to repair the diner's aging equipment free of charge. The room buzzed with unity, each person contributing in their own way. Emily moved through the crowd, her smile warm despite the exhaustion etched into her features. When their eyes met, she gave John a small, knowing nod. It was their silent acknowledgement of how far they'd come and the fight still ahead. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and only a few regulars lingered, someone fiddled with the jukebox in the corner. A familiar tune filled the room, soft and sweet, cutting through the tension of the day. Emily glanced toward the music, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. "Who picked that?" she asked, half laughing as she looked around. John smirked. "Maybe the diner just knows what we need." She rolled her eyes but smiled, a flush of color rising to her cheeks. "Oh, does it now?" As the song played, John held out a hand. "Dance with me." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Here? Now? Why not?" he said, his voice low and steady. "The world's not going anywhere." Her hesitation melted as she placed her hand in his, letting him lead her to an open space near the counter. The room seemed to shrink around them as they moved in time with the music, their steps unpracticed but effortless. The faint hum of the jukebox was the only sound, accompanied by the soft shuffle of their shoes against the floor. They didn't speak, but the silence between them was filled with unspoken words. John's grip was steady, his touch gentle, as though he feared the moment might shatter. Emily looked up at him, her gaze soft, her smile faint but genuine. It was a fragile, beautiful pause in the storm they were weathering, and neither wanted it to end. The moment passed, but the fight continued. The next day, John received a call from an unexpected source. Alan Grayson, an old rival from his days in real estate. The man had once competed fiercely with John, but Marcus's ambition had crossed even his lines. "Dalton's pushing too far," Grayson said. "I've got documents linking him to zoning violations. They won't stop him entirely, but they'll slow him down." John hesitated. Grayson wasn't exactly a saint, and his help would come with strings. But as he glanced at Emily, busy with another community meeting, he knew they needed every advantage they could get. "Send them over," John said finally. "I'll use whatever you've got." But Marcus wasn't idle. Days later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to the diner. Emily opened it with trembling hands, her expression darkening as she read the contents. "It's a cease and desist," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's claiming the diner's violating city codes. If we don't comply, he'll have grounds to shut us down." John took the papers, his jaw tightening as he skimmed the legal jargon. It was a classic Marcus move, use bureaucracy to strangle opposition. But as he looked around the diner, at the people who had gathered to protect it, he felt a surge of determination. "He's trying to scare us," John said firmly, "but we've got the truth on our side. He can't hide behind this forever." Emily met his gaze, her fear slowly giving way to resolve. "Then we keep going," she said. Together, as they prepared for the next battle, the warmth of their dance lingered between them, a quiet reminder of what they were fighting for. The diner hummed with quiet activity as the morning sun spilled through the windows, promising another day of planning and resistance. John and Emily worked side by side, coordinating tasks and preparing for the next round of challenges from Marcus. The community's unity had become their lifeline, and for a while, it felt like they might finally have the upper hand. But Marcus Dalton was not one to be easily cornered. Behind the scenes, he was already laying his next trap, one designed to fracture the trust that had become Emily and John's greatest weapon. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Deliveries that had resumed after the initial disruption began arriving late again. The quality of the supplies dwindled, with spoiled produce and half-filled orders becoming a frustrating norm. Emily assumed it was Marcus, but she couldn't prove it. Then the rumors began to circulate, whispered among the community members who had rallied so fiercely for the diner. "I heard Emily's been considering selling," someone murmured at a local grocery store. "They say John's not who he claims to be," another voice added. The whispers grew louder, fueled by planted doubts and misdirection. By the time they reached the diner, the damage was done. Loyal supporters started to question their efforts, their commitment wavered, and the once bustling meetings dwindled to a handful of steadfast regulars. John's frustration boiled over as he paced the kitchen. "This is Marcus's doing," he growled. "He's playing the long game, breaking us from the inside." Emily, exhausted from the constant setbacks, sat at the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee. But how? Who would turn against us like this? That question was answered later that day when Emily discovered that Peter, a trusted supplier and longtime ally of the diner, had been feeding information to Marcus in exchange for a lucrative contract. Confronting Peter in the middle of a delivery, Emily's voice trembled with betrayal. "How could you?" she demanded. "After everything this place has done for you?" Peter's expression was conflicted, but he avoided her gaze. "I have a family to think about, Emily. Marcus made me an offer I couldn't refuse." Her shoulders sagged as she watched him drive away, the sense of betrayal cutting deep. The day grew heavier still when John returned from meeting Grayson with grim news. "Marcus is moving faster than we anticipated," John said, slamming a stack of papers on the counter. "He's filing injunctions to block us from presenting evidence at the next council meeting." Emily stared at the papers, her resolve wavering. "It feels like every time we take a step forward, he's already 3 steps ahead." John rubbed the back of his neck, his frustration evident. "We can't keep up with him. He has money, influence, and power. I'm not sure we'll ever have enough to beat him." The weight of his words settled heavily between them, and for the first time, doubt crept into their partnership. John turned away, leaning against the counter, his fists clenched. "Maybe he's right about me," he muttered. "Maybe I'm just a washed-up has-been trying to play the hero." Emily stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She crossed the room and grabbed John's arm, forcing him to face her. "Don't you dare say that," she said fiercely, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've done more for this diner, for this community, than anyone else could. You've given them hope, John. You've given me hope." He looked at her, startled by the intensity in her eyes. "But what if I'm not enough? What if all of this falls apart because of me?" "It won't," she said firmly, "because you're not doing this alone. We're in this together, and no matter what Marcus throws at us, we'll find a way to fight back." Her words struck a chord deep within him, and for a moment, the weight of his doubt lifted. Emily's faith in him was unshakable, and it reignited a spark he thought he'd lost forever. That night, while Emily locked up the diner, John pored over the documents Grayson had provided. He studied every detail, searching for something, anything, that could give them an edge. Hours passed before he found it, a financial report buried within Marcus's holdings. It showed payments funneled through shell companies, tied to illegal rezoning efforts and bribes to city officials. John's pulse quickened as he pieced together the evidence. This wasn't just a potential scandal. It was enough to bring Marcus's empire crashing down. He rushed back to the diner, where Emily was preparing for bed in the small office she'd set up as her temporary home. She looked up, startled, as John burst through the door. "Emily, I've got it," he said, holding up the papers. "Proof of Marcus's corruption, bribes, illegal deals. It's all here." She took the papers, scanning them quickly before looking up at him, her eyes wide with hope. This could actually work. If we get this to the right people, he won't just lose the diner. He'll lose everything." John nodded, his determination solidifying. "We have to be smart about this. Marcus won't go down without a fight." Emily set the papers on the desk and stepped closer, her expression softening. "Then we'll fight him. Together." For the first time in weeks, the weight on their shoulders felt lighter. They had the tools to expose Marcus, and they had each other. No matter how difficult the road ahead, they were ready to face it, united in purpose and in hope. The city council chamber buzzed with quiet tension as residents filled the rows of wooden benches, their murmurs echoing off the high ceiling. John sat beside Emily at a long table near the front, their collected evidence stacked neatly before them. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on both of them. This was their chance, possibly their only chance, to stop Marcus Dalton for good. Emily glanced at John, her hand briefly brushing his under the table. "We've got this," she whispered, her voice steady but soft. John nodded, but his stomach churned. He wasn't just fighting Marcus, he was fighting his past, his mistakes, and the reputation Marcus had already begun to weaponize against him. The meeting began with the council chair introducing the agenda, her tone clipped and formal. As speakers presented their cases, Emily scanned the crowd, recognizing many familiar faces from the diner. Seeing them there, ready to fight for their community, bolstered her resolve. When it was finally their turn to speak, she stood, her back straight, and addressed the council. "My name is Emily Parker, and I'm here today to represent the voices of this community," she began. "For years, the diner I manage has been a gathering place, a safe haven for people from all walks of life. But Marcus Dalton's proposed development threatens not only the diner but also the homes and livelihoods of dozens of families." Her words carried a quiet strength that filled the room. She presented letters from residents, photos of the neighborhood, and testimonials from business owners, each piece reinforcing the impact Marcus's project would have. By the time she finished, even the council members seemed moved. John rose next, his hands gripping the edge of the podium. "I used to work with Marcus Dalton," he began, his voice even but firm. "I saw firsthand the tactics he uses to get what he wants: bribery, intimidation, and backroom deals. But this time, we have proof." He held up the documents they'd painstakingly gathered, detailing illegal rezoning deals and payments to city officials. The council members leaned forward as John methodically presented each piece, leaving no doubt about the corruption at play. When Marcus finally stood to respond, the room seemed to shift. Dressed impeccably and exuding confidence, he walked to the podium with a smirk that set John's teeth on edge. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began smoothly, "this is nothing more than a desperate attempt to derail a project that will bring progress and prosperity to this city." He turned to the council, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "And let's not forget who's making these accusations. John Hartley, a man who lost everything because of his own reckless decisions. Do you really trust someone like him to lecture us about ethics?" The jab hit its mark, and John felt the sting of humiliation ripple through him. The murmurs in the room grew louder, and for a moment, he faltered. But then he felt Emily's hand on his arm, grounding him. Standing, she addressed the room, her voice unwavering. "This isn't about John's past. It's about Marcus's actions now. The evidence speaks for itself, and no amount of deflection changes the fact that he's putting families out of their homes for personal gain. The crowd erupted into applause, and John felt a flicker of hope. Emily's belief in him was unshakable, and it gave him the strength to keep going. As the council deliberated, Marcus's lawyer approached John and Emily with a smug expression. "Mr. Dalton is willing to offer a settlement," he said, sliding a contract across the table. "If you agree to withdraw your claims, the diner can remain untouched." Emily looked at the paper, her jaw tightening. "And what happens to the rest of the neighborhood?" The lawyer shrugged. "That's business." John stared at the contract, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He could end the fight now, save the diner, and spare Emily further stress. But he knew it wouldn't be enough. He thought of the families, the homes, the people who believed in them. "No deal," John said, his voice resolute. "This fight isn't just about us." The final blow came when John made his sacrifice. He stood before the council, addressing both the members and the gathered crowd. "I'm prepared to buy the land under the diner," he announced. Gasps rippled through the room. "It's all I have left, but this community is worth it." Emily looked at him in shock, her eyes filling with tears. "John, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "Because this isn't just about saving a building. It's about doing what's right." The council members exchanged glances, clearly moved by his gesture. After a tense deliberation, the council chair finally spoke. "Given the evidence presented and the strong community opposition, we are suspending all permits for Mr. Dalton's project, pending a full investigation." Cheers erupted in the chamber as Marcus's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He stormed out of the room, his confident stride replaced with barely concealed fury. As the crowd began to disperse, Emily turned to John, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe you did that. You gave up everything." John shrugged, a small smile playing at his lips. "It wasn't everything. Not as long as I've got you." Tears glistened in Emily's eyes as she wrapped her arms around him, holding on tightly. "We did it, John," she whispered. Together, as they stepped out of the council building into the chilly night, the weight of their journey finally began to lift. For the first time in months, the future felt bright, one they would face side by side. The diner was alive with celebration, the hum of laughter, the clinking of coffee mugs, and the warm smell of freshly baked pies filled the air. People packed into the space, their spirits buoyed by the victory against Marcus Dalton. Banners hung from the walls with messages like "Community First" and "Together We Stand." Emily moved from table to table, her smile brighter than it had been in weeks, shaking hands and exchanging heartfelt thanks with the people who had stood by her. John stood near the counter, observing the lively scene. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar: contentment. The faces around him were filled with gratitude, and while he knew the battle hadn't been easy, the outcome made every sleepless night worth it. Emily caught his eye across the room and waved him over. "Don't just stand there, John. Join the party," she called, her voice carrying over the noise. He laughed softly and made his way to her side. "You're good at this," he said, gesturing toward the happy crowd. "Well," Emily replied, a mischievous glint in her eye, "it's easy when you've got something worth celebrating." They stood together, watching as neighbors and friends toasted the diner's survival. A sense of peace settled between them, unspoken but deeply felt. As the evening wound down and the last of the guests trickled out, the diner grew quiet again. Emily locked the front door and turned to find John leaning against the counter, his hands in his pockets. "You stayed," she said, her voice soft. "Didn't want to leave you with all this," John replied, nodding toward the table still cluttered with plates and glasses. They moved in sync, clearing dishes and wiping down surfaces. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated by the occasional laugh as they recounted moments from the celebration. When the last table was cleared, Emily turned to John, her expression shifting to something more serious. "You did something incredible, John," she said. "Not just for me, but for everyone here." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I just wanted to make things right. After everything I've done, everything I've lost, I didn't think I could. But you believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Emily stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't just make things right, John. You gave people hope. You gave me hope." His breath hitched as he looked at her, the weight of her words settling over him. Emily, he stopped, his voice catching. I don't know where I'd be without you. You're here, she said simply, a soft smile spreading across her face. And that's enough. She reached for his hand, and he took it, their fingers intertwining. The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotion. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, they leaned toward each other. The kiss was slow and tender, a culmination of everything they'd endured together. It wasn't just a promise of love. It was a testament to the trust and bond they'd built. The next morning, the headlines told the rest of the story. Marcus Dalton's empire was crumbling under the weight of the evidence presented at the council meeting. Investigations were launched into his corrupt dealings, and several of his projects were halted indefinitely. By midday, news broke that Marcus had been arrested on charges of fraud and bribery. At the diner, Emily read the updates aloud to a small group of regulars who had gathered for breakfast. Applause erupted when she reached the part about Marcus's arrest, and a cheer went up when someone joked about the king of real estate finally being dethroned. John stood near the kitchen, leaning against the doorway with a satisfied grin. It was a victory, not just for the diner, but for everyone Marcus had wronged over the years. Emily caught his eye and waved him over. Don't think you're off the hook, she teased. You're still on cleanup duty. He chuckled, shaking his head as he joined her. Yes, ma'am. As they worked side by side, the atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. The shadow Marcus had cast over their lives was gone, replaced by the warm glow of a brighter future. The fight had cost them both dearly. John had sacrificed the last of his financial resources, and Emily had weathered months of uncertainty, but it had also given them something far greater, each other. That evening, as the sun set over the neighborhood, John and Emily sat on the diner's front steps, watching the light fade into a soft orange haze. The streets were quiet now, the chaos of the past weeks finally giving way to calm. You ever think about what's next? Emily asked, breaking the silence. John tilted his head, considering her question. I've been so focused on the fight, I haven't thought much past it. Well, Emily said, leaning her head against his shoulder, whatever comes next, I'm glad you're here. He smiled, his hand finding hers. Me too. As the last light faded from the sky, the diner stood as a symbol of resilience and hope, a reminder that, even in the face of adversity, people could come together to protect what mattered most. And for John and Emily, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one they were ready to face together. The diner bustled with life, its hum now a familiar and comforting rhythm in the neighborhood. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the cheery atmosphere that had become the diner's signature. What once had been just a place for meals was now a true community hub. Families gathered at booths, workers stopped by for coffee and pie, and children played on the small chalkboard Emily had set up in the corner, drawing colorful pictures that decorated the walls. Emily moved with practiced ease, refilling mugs and chatting with customers. The stress that had weighed her down for months had lifted, replaced with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The fight to save the diner had strengthened her connection to the community, and seeing everyone come together reminded her of what she'd fought for. Across the room, John wiped down a table, his movements deliberate but relaxed. He'd found his place here, not just in the work, but in the purpose it gave him. Each customer's smile, each moment of connection, reaffirmed what Emily had been saying all along. He mattered, and the work they were doing mattered. Emily glanced over at John, catching him mid-conversation with a regular who was enthusiastically recounting a story. His laughter rang out, warm and genuine, and she couldn't help but smile. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. What? He asked as he approached the counter, wiping his hands on a towel. Nothing, she said, her grin widening. It's just nice to see you happy. John leaned on the counter, his expression softening. It's nice to be happy. Her heart swelled at his words. So, what's next for you, Mr. Hartley? She teased. Planning any big real estate ventures? He laughed, shaking his head. No skyscrapers in the works, I'm afraid. Honestly, I haven't thought much about what's next. But I do know one thing. And what's that? I want to be here, he said simply. With you. Emily's cheeks flushed, and she turned to refill a customer's cup, though her smile betrayed her delight. Well, we'll have to make sure we find room in the schedule, she quipped, her voice light. John chuckled but stepped closer, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. I mean it, Emily. This place it's home. Her eyes softened as she looked up at him. You're home too, John. As the day wore on, the diner's energy remained high. Regulars came and went, each leaving with a smile and often a piece of pie to go. By late afternoon, the staff had gathered for a meeting in the back, discussing plans for the future. Emily laid out her vision for the diner, which included expanding their menu and hosting community events, like book readings and charity nights. You've got some big ideas, John said after the meeting, a hint of pride in his voice. Well, now that we're not fighting to keep the lights on, we can actually dream a little, Emily replied, her excitement contagious. John nodded thoughtfully. What do you think about a community garden? There's that empty lot behind the diner. We could use it to grow fresh produce, maybe even teach kids how to garden. Emily's eyes lit up. I love that idea. Let's do it. Their conversation flowed easily, each idea building on the last. For the first time, their plans weren't about survival. They were about growth, about creating something lasting. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the diner hosted a celebration to thank the community for their support. Strings of twinkling lights hung from the ceiling, and the tables were pushed together to create a long banquet-style setup. The air was filled with laughter, the clatter of utensils, and the sound of live music played by a local band. Emily stood at the head of the room, a glass of lemonade in her hand. She tapped a spoon against the glass, and the room quieted. I just want to say thank you, she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. This diner has always been more than just a place to eat. It's a place for connection, for family. And that's because of all of you. We didn't save the diner. You did. So, here's to us, and to everything we'll build together. The room erupted into cheers, and Emily's eyes shimmered as she raised her glass. She turned to John, who was already watching her with a smile that said more than words ever could. As the night went on, John found Emily standing by the jukebox, watching the festivities with a contented expression. He joined her, his hand brushing hers. You know, he said, his tone playful, we make a pretty good team. Emily laughed, leaning into him slightly. I think so too. They stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The diner was more than just a building now. It was a symbol of resilience, hope, and love. And as they looked toward the future, they knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The morning sun glistened on the thin layer of snow that had blanketed the city overnight, casting a soft, pristine glow over the neighborhood. The park where John and Emily had first reconnected months ago looked different now. The bare trees, touched with frost, stood as silent witnesses to the journey they had taken together. The crisp air carried a sense of promise, and John, standing near the park's fountain, felt a nervous energy thrumming through him. In his pocket, a small box rested snugly, its presence both grounding and exhilarating. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind countless times, but nothing had prepared him for the way his heart raced as he saw Emily approaching. She wore her favorite winter coat, a knit scarf wrapped snugly around her neck, her auburn hair catching the pale sunlight. You're up to something, she teased as she reached him, a curious smile playing on her lips. John chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. You always could see right through me. Emily tilted her head, her gaze softening. What is it, John? Taking a deep breath, he reached for her hands, clasping them between his own. Emily, when I came back to this neighborhood, I was lost. I didn't think I deserved a second chance. At life, at love, at anything. But then I found you. Her eyes shimmered, her lips parting slightly as she listened. You reminded me of who I used to be, but more than that, you showed me who I could become. You've been my light, my hope, and my home. And I can't imagine my future without you. He let go of her hands briefly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the small velvet box. As he dropped to one knee, Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Emily Parker, will you marry me? For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The world around them fell silent, and all that existed was the look in Emily's eyes, a mixture of joy, disbelief, and overwhelming love. A tear slipped down her cheek as she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. John slipped the ring onto her finger, standing and pulling her into a tight embrace. The world melted away as they held each other, the the snow crunching softly beneath their feet. Later that evening, the community gathered at the diner for a planned celebration to honor the resilience and strength they'd shown in the fight against Marcus. But as Emily and John walked through the door, hand in hand, the ring on Emily's finger caught the light, drawing attention. The room erupted into cheers and applause as people realized what had happened. Beth, one of the waitresses, immediately grabbed a slice of pie to toast the happy couple, while others surrounded them with warm congratulations. It was a moment of joy shared by all, a fitting reflection of how the community had become a family. Mrs. Jenkins, the diner's retired owner, made a surprise appearance, walking up to Emily with a warm smile. "I always knew this place would bring people together, but I never imagined it would bring something like this." Emily laughed, hugging the older woman. "It's more than I ever dreamed." As the evening wore on, the celebration spilled into the streets. Neighbors strung up lights across the block, their warm glow illuminating the snow-covered pavement. Children built snowmen while adults gathered around fire pits, sharing stories and laughter. It was a scene straight out of a dream, one of unity, love, and hope. Near the end of the night, Emily and John stood near the edge of the park, watching as the celebration unfolded around them. The snow fell softly now, dusting their hair and shoulders like a delicate promise of renewal. "Do you remember the first time we stood here?" Emily asked, leaning into John's side. He smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "How could I forget? You gave me a meal and a reason to keep going. And you gave me a partner in this crazy journey," she said, her voice warm with affection. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of everything they'd endured settling into a deep, shared peace. The park, the diner, the neighborhood, it was all a testament to their resilience and the bonds they'd built together. "I think we've found our bright future," Emily said softly, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. John smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "And it's just getting started." As they turned back toward the diner, the sounds of laughter and celebration filling the air. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in a quiet promise of new beginnings. The challenges they had faced were behind them, but the love and hope they carried would guide them forward, into a tomorrow as bright as the snow at night.